Within 50 years, almost every major city in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed. Palaces burned. Trade networks that had existed for centuries vanished overnight. Writing itself disappeared from entire regions for 300 years. Civilizations that had stood for a millennium collapsed so completely that their names were forgotten. This wasn't a single war or a natural disaster. This was a cascading systems failure that reset human civilization to zero and plunged the ancient world into a dark age from which it would take centuries to recover. And the terrifying part? We still don't fully understand what caused it. This is the story of history's biggest reset, the moment when the ancient world ended and everything had to begin again. The year is 1200 BCE. The Late Bronze Age is at its height, the most interconnected, sophisticated, and prosperous period humanity has yet achieved. A network of great powers dominates the known world. In Egypt, Ramesses III rules the last golden age of the New Kingdom, commanding armies that stretch from Nubia to Syria. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire controls the heartland of modern Turkey, a military superpower whose iron weapons give them technological superiority over their neighbors. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians and Babylonians compete for dominance over the fertile river valleys. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces command fortified citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, administering complex bureaucracies recorded in Linear B script. These aren't isolated kingdoms. They're part of an integrated international system more sophisticated than anything that would exist again until the Roman Empire. Royal correspondence travels between courts in multiple languages, mediated by professional scribes and translators. Egyptian pharaohs address Hittite kings as brothers. Diplomatic marriages seal alliances. Treaties define borders and trade relationships. A Hittite prince can marry an Egyptian princess. A Babylonian king can request gold from Egypt to complete a temple. A Cypriot merchant can trade copper ingots from Cyprus to Egypt, receive Egyptian grain and papyrus, transport it to Greece, exchange it for pottery and olive oil, then sell that to the Hittites for silver. The material evidence of this interconnected world is overwhelming. Shipwrecks from this period, like the Uluburun wreck discovered off the coast of Turkey, reveal the extraordinary scope of late Bronze Age trade. A single merchant vessel carried copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, ebony from Africa, ivory from Syria, glass from Mesopotamia, pottery from Greece, and luxury goods from a dozen different regions. This wasn't rare. This was normal. Trade routes connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and overland routes stretching to India and beyond. The palace economies that managed this trade were marvels of bureaucratic organization. At Pylos in Greece, Linear B tablets record inventories of thousands of workers, hundreds of sheep, detailed records of textile production, bronze working, perfume manufacture, and agricultural output. The palace knows exactly how much grain each district produces, how many rowers each coastal village must provide for the fleet, how much bronze each smith receives, and what weapons he produces. This level of administrative control requires literacy, standardized weights and measures, professional bureaucrats, and complex accounting systems. Life in the late Bronze Age cities was comfortable for the elite and relatively stable for commoners. Multi-story palaces featured indoor plumbing, frescoed walls, sophisticated drainage systems, and storage facilities for surplus grain. International trade brought luxury goods within reach of wealthy families. Lapis lazuli jewelry from Afghanistan, amber beads from Northern Europe, fine pottery from across the Mediterranean, textiles dyed with expensive purple from murex shells. Cities were defended by massive fortifications, walls so thick and well-built that later Greeks would call them Cyclopean, believing only giants could have moved such enormous stones. The religious world of the late Bronze Age was equally interconnected. Gods traveled with merchants and armies. The Egyptian goddess Hathor had temples in Byblos on the Lebanese coast. Syrian deities appeared in Egyptian iconography. The Hittites practiced a form of religious syncretism, incorporating the gods of conquered peoples into their own pantheon. Shared mythological motifs appeared across cultures: flood stories, divine battles against chaos monsters, dying and rising gods, sacred marriages between deities. But underneath this prosperity and interconnection, the system was more fragile than anyone realized. The palace economies depended on stable trade routes, predictable agricultural surpluses, and complex supply chains that stretched across thousands of miles. Bronze, the defining technology of the age, required copper and tin, often sourced from different regions and combined by skilled metal workers. Disrupt the tin supply from Afghanistan or the copper supply from Cyprus, and the entire bronze industry collapses. The elaborate bureaucracies that managed everything required literacy, trained scribes, and stable political systems. Disrupt the training of scribes, and within a generation, writing itself could be lost. Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happens. Within the span of 50 years, almost every major city in the eastern Mediterranean is violently destroyed. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Athens, Troy, all burn. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, is abandoned and never reoccupied. Ugarit, a prosperous trading city on the Syrian coast, is destroyed so completely that it disappears from history and won't be rediscovered until the 20th century CE. Lachish, Hazor, Megiddo, and dozens of other cities in the Levant are sacked and burned. The destruction is not uniform or simultaneous, but it follows a pattern. Cities don't just fall to conquest and then rebuild under new rulers, as had happened countless times before. They're destroyed and abandoned. The survivors don't stay to rebuild, they flee. The palace systems that administered everything collapse completely. Trade stops, writing disappears, population plummets. Greece enters a dark age that will last 300 years, during which writing is completely lost and must be reinvented centuries later in a different form. Egypt survives, but barely. Ramesses III faces wave after wave of invaders he calls the Sea Peoples, groups of displaced populations attacking by land and sea. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu preserves detailed reliefs showing the battles, ships clashing in the Nile Delta, armies meeting on land, prisoners being led away in chains. The inscriptions describe the crisis in apocalyptic terms. The Sea Peoples have already destroyed the Hittites, devastated Cyprus, overwhelmed the cities of the Levantine coast. Now they're coming for Egypt, and Ramesses must hold the line or watch civilization itself collapse. Ramesses defeats the Sea Peoples, but the victory is Pyrrhic. Egypt is exhausted, economically devastated, surrounded by ruins where prosperous trading partners once stood. The international system that made Egypt wealthy no longer exists. Trade routes are cut. The tin necessary for bronze production becomes unavailable. The new kingdom enters terminal decline, losing its Asiatic empire, fragmenting internally, eventually splitting into competing kingdoms. The Golden Age is over. What caused this catastrophic collapse? For over a century, scholars have debated this question, and the answer is frustratingly complex because there is no single answer. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was a perfect storm of multiple interconnected crises that reinforced each other until the entire system failed. The traditional explanation, dating back to the ancient sources themselves, blames invasions. The Sea Peoples destroyed everything, but this explanation immediately raises questions. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Why did they attack? And most importantly, why were they successful against civilizations that had weathered invasions before? The Sea Peoples is a term Egyptians used to describe multiple groups of attackers coming by sea and land. The inscriptions name specific groups: Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denien, Weshesh. Some scholars identify the Peliset with the Philistines, who appear in the Bible settling on the southern Levantine coast. But identification is difficult and controversial. Were these invading armies or refugees fleeing their own collapsing homelands? Were they organized military forces or desperate populations migrating en masse? The evidence suggests both, at different times and places. Recent scholarship emphasizes that the Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the collapse so much as a symptom of it. They appear because their own homelands were experiencing crisis, forcing them to migrate. They were successful because the societies they attacked were already weakened by other factors. They weren't unstoppable warriors. They were refugees who happened to arrive when the Bronze Age system was already failing. So what was weakening these civilizations before the Sea Peoples arrived? Climate change, for one. Paleoclimate data from tree rings, ice cores, and sediment analysis shows that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for several decades. This wasn't a single bad harvest year. This was a persistent, multi-generational drought that devastated agriculture across the entire region. The late Bronze Age civilizations depended on agricultural surplus. The palace economies stockpiled grain to feed specialized workers, professional soldiers, bureaucrats and artisans who didn't produce their own food. A few bad harvests could be managed by drawing on reserves, but prolonged drought meant reserves ran out. Famines began. Populations weakened. Social unrest increased. When people are starving, they don't calmly maintain complex bureaucratic systems. They revolt, they migrate, they raid their neighbors for food. The Hittite archives from just before the collapse preserve desperate letters requesting emergency grain shipments. Ugarit's final letters, never sent because the city was destroyed before they could be dispatched, describe ships bringing food but also warn of enemy ships approaching. The city was caught between famine and invasion, dependent on maritime grain shipments that made it vulnerable to piracy and attack. Drought wasn't the only environmental stress. Earthquake evidence shows a significant increase in seismic activity around 1200 BCE. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on multiple fault lines, and when earthquakes strike, they can devastate Bronze Age cities. The massive fortification walls, while impressive, were vulnerable to earthquake damage. Many destruction layers at Bronze Age sites show evidence of earthquake damage before or simultaneous with burning and violent destruction. Earthquakes don't just destroy buildings. In the Bronze Age, they disrupt complex systems. If an earthquake damages the water supply system at a major city, the population may need to abandon it temporarily. If it strikes during a drought when alternative water sources are scarce, temporary abandonment can become permanent. If it damages fortifications, the city becomes vulnerable to attack. If it destroys palace storerooms during a famine, it can trigger immediate crisis. But environmental stress alone doesn't explain why the collapse was so complete and long-lasting. Other civilizations have survived droughts and earthquakes. The unique vulnerability of Bronze Age civilization lay in its interconnectedness. The same networks that created prosperity also created systemic fragility. When one part of the system failed, it triggered cascading failures throughout the entire network. Consider the tin problem. Bronze requires copper and tin in roughly a 9-to-1 ratio. Copper was relatively abundant, mined in Cyprus, Anatolia, the Sinai, and other locations around the Mediterranean, but tin was rare. The primary sources were in Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall in Britain, both extremely far from the Eastern Mediterranean. Tin had to travel thousands of miles along trade routes through multiple kingdoms, across dangerous territories, transferred between many merchants, each adding cost and risk. When the Central Asian trade routes were disrupted, whether by drought, political instability, or nomadic incursions, the tin supply dried up. Without tin, you can't make bronze. Without bronze, you can't make the weapons, tools, and agricultural implements that Bronze Age societies depended on. Armies become less effective. Agricultural productivity drops. Social unrest increases. The civilization named for its characteristic technology cannot function without that technology. Some societies tried to compensate by hoarding existing bronze, melting down old implements to make new ones, or substituting inferior metals. But these were stopgap measures. The archaeological record shows a dramatic decline in bronze production across the Eastern Mediterranean after 1200 BCE, suggesting the tin trade had indeed collapsed. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was a technological catastrophe that undermined the military and economic foundations of Bronze Age civilization. The collapse of trade had other cascading effects. Luxury goods stopped flowing between courts, undermining the diplomatic relationships that depended on gift exchange. Grain shipments that fed cities couldn't get through. Skilled craftsmen who depended on imported materials couldn't work. Port cities that lived on commerce withered. The palace economies that managed everything depended on trade revenues. When trade stopped, palace revenues collapsed, undermining their ability to pay armies, feed workers, or maintain legitimacy. Political instability made everything worse. When palaces couldn't pay armies, soldiers either deserted or turned to banditry. When they couldn't feed workers, labor forces dispersed. When they couldn't maintain irrigation systems, agricultural productivity dropped further. When they couldn't perform religious ceremonies properly, they lost ideological legitimacy. The elaborate bureaucratic systems that managed Bronze Age civilization required stability and resources to function. Remove either, and the entire administrative apparatus could collapse within a generation. The loss of literacy is particularly telling. Bronze Age literacy was restricted to trained scribes who spent years learning complex writing systems. In Greece, Linear B was used exclusively for palace accounting, not for literature or personal communication. It was a tool of bureaucracy. When the palaces fell, the scribes who served them lost their employment and social position. Without institutional support, the training system collapsed. Within a generation, nobody remembered how to read or write. Linear B was completely forgotten and would not be deciphered until the 20th century CE, 3,000 years later. This wasn't universal. Egypt maintained literacy because Egyptian writing served religious and monumental functions beyond palace administration. Egyptian scribes were employed by temples, wealthy individuals, and the state. Even when political unity fragmented, literacy survived because it served multiple functions. But in the Aegean and parts of the Levant, writing was so closely tied to palace administration that when the palaces fell, writing died with them. The population collapse was staggering. Greece's population dropped by perhaps 50 to 75% in the century after 1200 BCE. Villages were abandoned. Agricultural land reverted to wilderness. The survivors lived in small, dispersed settlements, practicing subsistence agriculture, with no writing, no monumental architecture, no long-distance trade, no complex political organization. Archaeological surveys show a dramatic decrease in the number of occupied sites and a shift towards smaller, simpler settlements. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so different from other ancient crises. It wasn't just political change, one empire replacing another. It was civilizational regression, a return to simpler forms of social organization, a loss of accumulated knowledge and technology, a reduction in population density and economic complexity. It was a true dark age, and it would last for centuries. But while Greece plunged into darkness, other regions experienced different trajectories. Egypt survived, weakened but intact. Assyria actually expanded, eventually building an empire larger than anything seen before. The Phoenician cities on the Levantine coast recovered relatively quickly, developing new maritime trade networks that would eventually span the entire Mediterranean. Israel and Judah emerged as small kingdoms in the hill country. New peoples and cultures filled the vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse. What allowed some societies to survive while others disappeared? Geography mattered. Egypt's Nile-based agriculture was more resilient to drought than rain-fed agriculture elsewhere. The river flooded annually based on rainfall in distant Ethiopia, making Egypt less vulnerable to local climate variations. Egypt's isolation, protected by deserts, made it less vulnerable to invasion. Egypt's strong religious and ideological foundations gave it cultural continuity, even through political fragmentation. Assyria's survival and eventual dominance came partly from military innovation. The Assyrians were early adopters of iron technology, which didn't require tin, and could be produced from more abundant iron ore deposits. Iron weapons weren't initially superior to bronze, but they were more available during the tin shortage. Assyria also maintained a highly militarized society that could defend itself and opportunistically expand when neighbors weakened. The Phoenician cities survived by adapting their economic model. When the palace-administered trade networks collapsed, Phoenician merchants developed more flexible, decentralized trading systems. They became maritime explorers, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, trading with whoever would trade with them, regardless of palace politics. By the first millennium BCE, Phoenician traders had reached Spain, Morocco, possibly even circumnavigated Africa. Their alphabet, simpler and more accessible than Bronze Age syllabic scripts, spread throughout the Mediterranean and became the ancestor of Greek, Latin, and eventually most modern alphabets. Israel emerged in the hill country of Canaan during the Bronze Age collapse, possibly formed partly from refugees fleeing destroyed lowland cities. The biblical narratives of the Exodus and conquest may preserve fragmentary memories of the late Bronze Age upheavals, though the archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of Israel was more gradual settlement than dramatic conquest. What's clear is that new ethnic and political identities formed during and after the collapse, filling spaces left by vanished Bronze Age powers. The Dark Age following the Bronze Age collapse wasn't completely dark. People still lived, farmed, fought, loved, told stories, made art. But the complex, interconnected, literate civilization of the late Bronze Age was gone. It would take 3 centuries before Greece began to emerge from the Dark Age, developing the city-states that would eventually produce classical Greek civilization. And that new civilization would be fundamentally different from what came before. Built on different political models, using a different writing system, worshipping the gods in different ways, remembering the Bronze Age palaces only in myths and legends about heroes and gods. But the Bronze Age collapse wasn't history's only reset. The pattern would repeat in different forms multiple times across the ancient world. Jump forward 1400 years to the 3rd century CE and the Roman Empire, the most powerful political entity the world has yet seen, faces its own cascading crisis that nearly destroys everything. The year is 235 CE. Emperor Alexander Severus is assassinated by his own troops while campaigning against Germanic tribes on the northern frontier. His death triggers the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of near-continuous civil war, foreign invasion, economic collapse, and plague that brings Roman civilization to the brink of extinction. Between 235 and 284 CE, at least 26 men claim the imperial throne. Most reign for months or a few years before being murdered by rivals or their own soldiers. Some reign simultaneously in different parts of the empire as multiple claimants fight for supremacy. The crisis of the 3rd century reveals how even the most powerful empire can experience systemic collapse when multiple stresses compound. Rome, in 235 CE, is at its territorial peak, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. 60 million people live under Roman rule. Roads connect every major city. A common currency facilitates trade. Roman law governs disputes. Roman legions guard the frontiers. Aqueducts bring water to cities. Theaters and amphitheaters provide entertainment. Baths offer relaxation. It seems eternal, inevitable, permanent. But underneath the surface, structural problems are accumulating. The Roman economy depends on continuous expansion, on conquering new territories that provide plunder, slaves, and tribute. By the 2nd century CE, expansion has stopped. The frontiers are at their maximum sustainable extent. There are no more easy conquests. The Parthian Empire to the east is too powerful to defeat decisively. The Germanic tribes to the north are too numerous and dispersed to conquer completely. The deserts to the south and ocean to the west provide natural boundaries. Without expansion, the economic model stalls. The influx of wealth slows. The emperors still need to pay the legions that guard the frontiers. They still need to fund the grain dole that feeds Rome's poor. They still need to maintain infrastructure, fund building projects, support the imperial bureaucracy. The costs remain constant or increase, but the revenues plateau. The emperors respond by debasing the currency, reducing the silver content of coins while maintaining their face value. This creates inflation, undermining economic stability. The army becomes increasingly problematic. In the early empire, legions were recruited from Roman citizens, primarily from Italy and Romanized provinces. They served for 20 to 25 years, received good pay and benefits, and retired with land grants. They were professional, disciplined, loyal to Rome itself, rather than to individual generals. But by the 3rd century, citizenship has been extended to almost all free inhabitants of the empire. There's no longer a distinctive Roman military culture. Increasingly, emperors recruit barbarian tribes wholesale, paying them to fight for Rome rather than against it. These troops are effective warriors, but less invested in Roman institutions and more loyal to their commanders than to Rome. The frontiers come under increasing pressure. Germanic tribes, themselves displaced by migrations further east, push against the Rhine-Danube frontier. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which has replaced the Parthians, is more aggressive and better organized than its predecessor. In 260 CE, Emperor Valerian leads an army against the Sassanids and is captured, the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The Persians use him as a footstool for their king to mount his horse, the ultimate humiliation. He dies in captivity, and his skin is stuffed and displayed as a trophy. The empire fragments. In the west, a breakaway Gallic empire controls Gaul, Britain, and Spain from 260 to 274 CE. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carves out an independent kingdom controlling Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. For a few years, the central Roman government controls only Italy, the Balkans, and North Africa. The empire has effectively split into three competing states, each claiming to be the true Rome. Plague makes everything worse. The Antonine Plague, which struck in the 160s CE, may have killed up to 5 million people. The Plague of Cyprian in the 250s CE kills thousands daily in Rome itself. Ancient accounts describe corpses piling up in the streets, mass graves being dug, entire cities depopulated. Modern scholars debate the exact nature of these plagues, whether they were smallpox, measles, or something else, but their impact is undeniable. Plague disrupts agriculture, depopulates cities, kills soldiers, and undermines economic productivity. It also creates psychological trauma and religious crisis, as people question why the gods have abandoned Rome. Christianity grows rapidly during the 3rd century crisis, partly because it offers explanations and comfort that traditional Roman religion cannot provide. When plague strikes and traditional gods seem powerless, Christianity says the old gods were never real. When the empire fragments and emperors are murdered, Christianity says earthly power is temporary and only God's kingdom is eternal. When economic hardship makes life harsh, Christianity promises reward in the afterlife. The persecutions Christians suffer under some emperors actually strengthen the movement by creating martyrs and demonstrating commitment. The military responds to crisis by demanding more pay, more donatives, more privileges. Emperors who can't pay are murdered and replaced by generals who promise more. This creates a vicious cycle. Each new emperor needs to secure army loyalty with immediate payments, which requires raising more money, which requires more taxation or more debasement, which creates more economic stress, which makes the army more restless. The empire is eating itself, consuming its own resources to prevent immediate collapse while undermining long-term stability. Cities across the empire shrink and fortify. In the peaceful 2nd century, many cities had expanded beyond their old walls, building suburbs and amenities in the surrounding countryside. In the 3rd century, they retreat behind walls, abandon suburbs, and prepare for siege. The archaeological evidence shows dramatically reduced urban areas. Hastily built fortifications using stones, recycled from dismantled public buildings, hordes of coins buried and never recovered, suggesting their owners died or fled. The crisis finally ends with Diocletian, who becomes emperor in 284 CE and implements radical reforms that temporarily stabilize the empire but fundamentally transform its character. Diocletian recognizes that the empire is too large for one man to govern effectively. He establishes the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves, each with a senior emperor and a junior emperor, 4 men sharing power in theory, though constantly competing in practice. Diocletian massively expands the bureaucracy, creating a more centralized, more controlled administrative system. He reforms taxation, making it more predictable, but also more oppressive. He attempts to control prices and wages throughout the empire through edict, though this largely fails. He reorganizes the army, separating frontier troops from mobile field armies, increasing total military size while reducing the size of individual units to prevent generals from accumulating too much power. Most dramatically, Diocletian transforms the emperor from princeps, first citizen, to dominus, lord and master. He adopts Persian-style court ceremonial, requiring subjects to prostrate themselves before him. He wears purple silk and a jeweled diadem. He lives in palaces separated from ordinary people. The emperor is no longer a Roman magistrate with extraordinary powers. He's an autocrat, a sacred figure, distant and absolute. This works in the short term, restoring stability through authoritarian control. But it also marks the end of the Principate, the governmental system established by Augustus, and the beginning of the Dominate, a more obviously monarchical and less Roman system. Diocletian's reforms buy time, but don't solve the underlying problems. The empire remains too large, too complex, too expensive to maintain. The army remains unreliable, the frontiers remain under pressure, the economy remains stressed. Christianity continues to grow despite persecution, creating a competing source of loyalty and authority. When Diocletian retires in 305 CE, the tetrarchy immediately collapses into civil war. Constantine eventually emerges victorious, founding a new dynasty and making two fateful decisions that reshape the ancient world. First, Constantine legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, ending centuries of intermittent persecution. He doesn't immediately make Christianity the state religion that comes later under Theodosius, but he clearly favors Christians, funding church construction, exempting clergy from taxes, presiding over church councils to resolve theological disputes. By the end of Constantine's reign, Christianity has imperial patronage, access to state resources, and is rapidly becoming the dominant religion of the empire. This transformation is astonishingly rapid and consequential. In 300 CE, Christians are a persecuted minority, perhaps 10% of the empire's population, concentrated in eastern cities. By 400 CE, Christianity is the official state religion, paganism is increasingly suppressed, and the Bishop of Rome is becoming one of the most powerful men in the empire. The entire religious, cultural, and intellectual foundation of Roman civilization has been replaced within a century. Constantine's second fateful decision is to move the imperial capital from Rome to Constantinople, the city he founds on the site of ancient Byzantium. This acknowledges a reality that has been true for centuries. The empire's center of gravity is in the east. The wealthiest provinces are in the eastern Mediterranean. The most serious military threats come from Persia in the east and Germanic tribes crossing the Danube in the Balkans. Italy is peripheral, living off past glory and grain shipments from Africa. Rome itself is increasingly irrelevant to imperial governance. Constantinople becomes the new Rome, strategically located to control trade between the Mediterranean and Black Sea, defendable with massive walls, wealthy from Eastern trade. The city Constantine builds is explicitly Christian, filled with churches rather than pagan temples, though it maintains Roman political institutions and Greek cultural traditions. It will survive for another 1100 years, long after Rome itself has fallen, preserving Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian theology through the Middle Ages. But moving the capital east effectively abandons the west. The western provinces become a secondary concern, defended by smaller armies, governed by weaker emperors, increasingly left to fend for themselves. The Western Empire becomes vulnerable to the very barbarian migrations and invasions that will ultimately destroy it. The 4th and 5th centuries see the gradual unraveling of Roman authority in the West. It's not usually violent or dramatic. It's more like slow decomposition, as the structures of Roman governance gradually cease to function and local strongmen, barbarian kings, and church bishops fill the vacuum. The frontiers aren't decisively breached by military defeat, so much as gradually dissolved by demographic pressure, military necessity, and policy failures. The key transformation is the settlement of barbarian peoples within the empire. Since the late empire needs soldiers and the barbarian tribes need land, emperors allow tribes to settle in frontier provinces in exchange for military service. These foederati, federated allies, are supposed to defend Roman territory against other barbarians while slowly Romanizing themselves. In practice, they maintain their own leadership, laws, and culture, creating kingdoms within the empire that are nominally subject to Rome, but increasingly independent. The Visigoths are a case study in this process. They're a Gothic tribe that flees Hunnic expansion in the 370s CE and requests permission to settle in Roman territory. The emperor agrees, but Roman officials exploit the refugees, charging exorbitant prices for food, forcing them to sell their children into slavery. The Goths revolt, defeat a Roman army at Adrianople in 378 CE, killing Emperor Valens, and rampage through the Balkans for years before accepting a settlement. They are granted land and autonomy in exchange for military service, but they remain a coherent military force under their own kings, ready to revolt when Rome doesn't keep its promises. In 410 CE, the Visigothic king Alaric sacks Rome itself after the Western emperor refuses to pay promised subsidies. This is the first time Rome has been captured by foreign enemies in 800 years. The shock reverberates throughout the empire. If Rome can fall, nothing is safe. The Visigoths eventually move on to Spain, establishing a kingdom there that will last for 3 centuries, but they've demonstrated that barbarian tribes can defeat Roman armies and defy emperors with impunity. Other tribes follow. The Vandals cross the Rhine in 406 CE with Alans and Suebi, overwhelming Gaul's defenses and eventually reaching Spain and North Africa. Under their king Genseric, they establish a kingdom in North Africa centered on Carthage, seizing the provinces that had fed Rome for centuries. In 455 CE, a Vandal fleet sails from Carthage and sacks Rome, looting systematically for 2 weeks. The Western Empire loses its grain supply, its richest provinces, and any pretense of military dominance. The Huns under Attila pose the most dramatic threat in the 440s and 450s CE. They're not Germanic, but steppe nomads from Central Asia, expert horsemen and archers who build a short-lived but terrifying empire stretching from Central Europe to the Caspian Sea. Attila extracts enormous tribute from both Eastern and Western empires, threatening to attack if not paid. He invades Gaul in 451 CE and Italy in 452 CE, before dying suddenly in 453 CE. His empire immediately collapses, but the Huns have been the catalyst for massive population movements as Germanic tribes flee westward to escape them, creating a domino effect of migrations that overwhelms Roman frontier defenses. Britain is abandoned around 410 CE as Roman legions withdraw to defend more critical areas. The Romano-British population is left to defend itself against Saxon, Angle and Jute raiders who eventually settle and establish kingdoms. Within a few generations, Roman Britain becomes Anglo-Saxon England. Latin disappears as a spoken language. Roman cities are abandoned. Christianity survives, but barely. The province regresses to a pre-Roman level of social organization, losing literacy, long-distance trade and political unity. Gaul is overrun by Franks, Burgundians and Visigoths, who establish kingdoms nominally under Roman authority, but increasingly independent. The Frankish kingdom will eventually become the most powerful barbarian state, expanding under Clovis and his successors to control most of Western Europe. The Franks maintain some Roman administrative practices and convert to Catholic Christianity, allowing them to gain support from the Romanized population and the Church. But Gaul has ceased to be Roman in any meaningful sense by the early 6th century. Italy itself, the heartland, experiences repeated invasions and power struggles. After Attila's death, various Germanic generals dominate the Western emperors, making and unmaking them at will. The emperors become puppets, holding ceremonial positions, while real power rests with barbarian military commanders. In 476 CE, the Germanic general Odoacer deposes the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and rules Italy directly without bothering to appoint a new emperor. The Western Roman Empire has ended, not with a dramatic battle, but with a whimper. A teenage emperor pensioned off, an office simply left vacant because nobody sees the point of continuing the pretense. Why did the Western Empire fall while the Eastern Empire survived? This has been debated for 1500 years, with hundreds of explanations offered. Edward Gibbon famously blamed Christianity, arguing it sapped Roman martial virtue. Others have blamed lead poisoning from Roman aqueducts, moral decay, economic exploitation, overstretched frontiers, climate change, and countless other factors. The truth is multifactorial and complex, involving interactions between long-term structural weaknesses and short-term crises. The East survived partly because it was wealthier. Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia were more populous and economically productive than the Western provinces. The Eastern Emperor could afford larger armies and pay higher taxes. The East also had more defensible geography, with the Danube and Euphrates as natural frontiers and the capital of Constantinople protected by massive walls and sea approaches. The Eastern Empire faced serious threats from Persia, but Persia was an organized state with which Rome could negotiate, sign treaties, and establish stable frontiers. The Germanic tribes were more numerous, more dispersed, and harder to deal with diplomatically. The West was also more exposed to the Hunnic invasions and subsequent Germanic migrations. When the Huns pushed westward, they displaced tribe after tribe, creating cascading waves of refugees and warriors seeking new homes. The Eastern Empire faced this pressure on its Danubian frontier, but the Western Empire faced it on longer, less defensible frontiers in Germany, Gaul, and along the Rhine. The geography of the West made it harder to defend and easier for barbarians to penetrate deeply into Roman territory. But there's another factor that's less often emphasized. The West suffered a collapse of legitimacy and institutional confidence. By the 5th century, many people in the Western provinces no longer believed the Roman Empire served their interests. Taxes were oppressive, military protection was unreliable, the government was distant, corrupt, and ineffective. Local strongmen, church bishops, and barbarian kings often provided better security, justice, and stability than Roman officials. Why die defending an empire that couldn't defend you? Why pay taxes to a government that provided nothing in return? The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority in the West often maintained Roman administrative structures, employed Roman bureaucrats, preserved Roman law for the Romanized population, and presented themselves as continuing Roman tradition. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526 CE, saw himself as a Roman king governing Romans and Goths according to their respective laws. He restored Roman buildings, sponsored learning, and maintained the Senate. From his perspective, he wasn't destroying Rome. He was preserving it under more effective management. This raises profound questions about what civilization is and what it means for it to end. The physical infrastructure of Rome persisted for centuries after 476 CE. Aqueducts continued to supply water, roads continued to connect cities, buildings stood, though increasingly repurposed or quarried for building materials. Latin continued as the language of the church, law, and learning, though it evolved into the Romance languages among common people. Roman law continued to govern, though modified by Germanic customary law. Christianity, which had become the official religion of the late empire, expanded under barbarian kingdoms, converting the conquerors and providing cultural continuity. What ended was the political unity of the Mediterranean world, the centralized administration, the professional army, the standardized currency, the safe long-distance trade, the vibrant urban life, the high culture of literature and philosophy, and eventually, in the West, literacy itself, outside church and court. The early medieval West was poorer, more localized, more violent, and less literate than the Roman Empire at its height. It was a reset, not as complete as the Bronze Age collapse, but still a significant regression in political organization, economic complexity, and cultural sophistication. What patterns emerge when we compare these great resets of the ancient world? First, complexity creates vulnerability. Both Bronze Age civilization and the Roman Empire were marvels of organization, integrating vast territories, populations, and resources into functioning systems. But that integration created dependencies and fragilities. When trade networks failed, Bronze Age cities couldn't get tin for bronze. When grain shipments from Africa stopped, Rome couldn't feed its population. The more specialized and interconnected a civilization becomes, the more vulnerable it is to systemic shocks. Second, environmental stress acts as a threat multiplier. Neither drought nor plague alone would have destroyed Bronze Age civilization or the Roman Empire. But combined with other stresses, political, military, economic, they became catastrophic. Climate change didn't cause the Bronze Age collapse, but it made societies less resilient when other crises hit. Plague didn't cause Rome's fall, but it killed soldiers, depopulated cities, and undermined economic productivity at the worst possible time. Third, military pressure matters, but usually as the final blow rather than the root cause. The Sea Peoples destroyed Bronze Age cities, but those cities were already weakened by drought, earthquake, and systems failure. Germanic tribes overran the Western Empire, but Rome was already struggling with civil war, economic collapse, and legitimacy crisis. Invasions tend to succeed when civilizations are already in crisis, exploiting vulnerabilities rather than creating them. Fourth, the loss of literacy and learning can create dark ages from which recovery is slow and difficult. When Linear B was forgotten after the Bronze Age collapse, Greek civilization had to reinvent writing centuries later using the Phoenician alphabet. When classical learning declined in the early medieval West, much ancient knowledge was lost and only gradually recovered during the Carolingian Renaissance and later medieval Renaissances. Literacy is fragile, requiring institutional support and educated elites to maintain. When those institutions fail, literacy can disappear within a generation, and its loss makes all other forms of cultural transmission more difficult. Fifth, religion and ideology can provide continuity through political collapse. The Israelites maintained identity through the Bronze Age upheavals, partly through religious tradition. Christianity provided cultural continuity through Rome's fall, preserving literacy, Latin and Roman law through church institutions. Religion offers meaning, community, and institutions that can survive political fragmentation. It can also provide legitimacy for new rulers, as when Clovis converted to Christianity to gain support from the Romanized population and church hierarchy. Sixth, not all regions experience crisis equally. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse better than Greece. The Eastern Roman Empire survived while the West fell. Geography, economics, social structure, and contingent historical events create different outcomes in different places. Collapse isn't uniform or inevitable. Some societies adapt successfully, while neighbors disappear. Understanding what allows some to survive while others fail is crucial. Seventh, recovery is possible, but takes centuries and produces something different. Classical Greek civilization emerged from Bronze Age collapse after 300 years, but it was fundamentally different. Smaller political units, different writing, different social organization. Western European civilization eventually emerged from Rome's fall, but medieval Europe wasn't Roman even when it claimed Roman heritage. Resets produce genuine discontinuities, breaks with the past that allow new forms to emerge. These patterns matter because they help us understand not just the ancient world but our own vulnerability. Modern global civilization is more complex, more interconnected, and more dependent on long supply chains than anything the ancient world achieved. We depend on global networks for food, energy, manufactured goods, information, and technology. Our literacy and knowledge are stored in forms, digital files, cloud servers that could be more fragile than parchment or stone. Our climate is changing, stressed by human activity. Our political systems face legitimacy challenges. Our military capabilities include weapons that could cause civilizational collapse in hours. Are we vulnerable to a reset comparable to the Bronze Age collapse or Rome's fall? The comparison is imperfect because our civilization is different in scale, technology, and organization. But the underlying dynamics, complexity creating vulnerability, multiple stresses compounding, system failures cascading, remain relevant. Understanding how ancient civilizations collapsed might help us avoid or at least mitigate similar outcomes. But there's another way to read these ancient resets. They're not just cautionary tales, they're also stories of resilience and renewal. The Bronze Age collapse was catastrophic, but new civilizations emerged from it. Classical Greece, Phoenicia, Israel, new kingdoms and cultures that developed in the spaces left empty. Rome's fall was traumatic, but medieval European civilization eventually developed its own achievements. Gothic cathedrals, universities, scholastic philosophy, new technologies. The resets destroyed old forms, but created possibilities for new forms. This doesn't minimize the suffering of those who lived through the collapses. People starved, died in wars, saw their cities burn, watched their cultures disappear. The Dark Ages were dark for those who experienced them, but on longer timescales, the resets weren't endings. They were transformations, painful transitions to different forms of civilization that eventually developed their own sophistication, achievements, and complexities. The ancient world that ended in these resets wasn't coming back. The Bronze Age palace economies wouldn't return. The unified Roman Mediterranean wouldn't return. But new worlds emerged, inheriting fragments from what came before and building something different. The Phoenician alphabet that emerged after the Bronze Age collapse became the basis for most modern writing systems. The Christian church that survived Rome's fall preserved classical learning and eventually sponsored new intellectual movements. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Rome eventually produced Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire and the later Holy Roman Empire. What really ended the ancient world then wasn't just invasions or environmental catastrophe or economic collapse. It was the failure of old systems to adapt to new circumstances, the rigidity of institutions that couldn't transform when transformation became necessary. The Bronze Age palace economies were marvelously efficient at managing stable conditions, but they couldn't adapt when climate changed and trade networks failed. The Roman Empire was brilliantly designed to conquer and administer territory, but it couldn't transform itself into something sustainable when expansion stopped and frontiers came under pressure. The civilizations that survived these crises were those that could adapt. The Phoenicians survived by abandoning palace-administered trade for more flexible merchant networks. The Eastern Roman Empire survived by transforming from the Principate to the Dominate, then transforming again into the Byzantine Empire with its Greek language, Orthodox Christianity, and different administrative structures. Adaptation meant abandoning some aspects of traditional civilization, accepting loss and change, finding new ways to organize society for new circumstances. This suggests a paradox about civilization and collapse. The characteristics that make civilizations successful, organization, specialization, integration, standardization, can also make them vulnerable. The more invested a society becomes in specific technologies, trade networks, political structures, the harder it becomes to adapt when circumstances change. But the societies that survive are those that can maintain core functions and values while transforming surface structures that can preserve what matters while discarding what doesn't work anymore. This is the deepest lesson from history's biggest resets. They remind us that no civilization is permanent, that the systems we depend on are more fragile than they appear, that collapse is always possible even for the most powerful societies. But they also show that endings are also beginnings, that the destruction of old forms creates space for new possibilities, that human creativity and resilience can rebuild even after catastrophic loss. The question for our own time is whether we can learn from these ancient examples without having to relive them. Can we recognize systemic vulnerabilities before they cascade into collapse? Can we build resilience into our systems rather than pursuing efficiency at the cost of flexibility? Can we adapt institutions and technologies to changing circumstances rather than clinging to forms that no longer work? Can we maintain core functions and values through transformation rather than letting them be lost in the chaos of unmanaged collapse? The Bronze Age collapse teaches us about the dangers of long, fragile supply chains and single points of failure. Depending on tin from Afghanistan made sense economically, maximizing efficiency, but it created catastrophic vulnerability when those routes were disrupted. Modern just-in-time supply chains maximize efficiency similarly, but a pandemic, a war, or a climate disaster can reveal how quickly they fail. Building redundancy, maintaining reserves, and developing local alternatives costs more in stable times, but provides resilience in crises. The crisis of the 3rd century teaches us about the dangers of institutions that can't handle succession peacefully. Rome's problem wasn't lack of capable leaders. It was lack of a system that could transfer power without violence. When every succession became a potential civil war, the empire bled itself dry fighting itself. Modern democracies with clear succession mechanisms and peaceful transfer of power often take these for granted. But recent events remind us how fragile these norms can be. Once violence becomes an acceptable tool for gaining or keeping power, the descent into crisis can be rapid. Rome's fall teaches us that complexity requires constant maintenance and adaptation. The Roman Empire worked brilliantly for centuries, but when expansion stopped and the economic model no longer functioned, the system couldn't adapt. Institutions ossified. Solutions that worked in the 2nd century no longer worked in the 5th. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Rome were in some ways less sophisticated, but they were better adapted to the circumstances of the 5th and 6th centuries. Sometimes survival requires simplification, accepting loss of capabilities to maintain core functions. But the ancient resets also teach us not to despair when transformation seems inevitable. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse didn't know that classical Greek civilization would eventually emerge. The Romans, watching barbarian kingdoms replace imperial provinces, didn't know that medieval European civilization would develop its own achievements. From inside the collapse, the future looks dark. But on longer timescales, these catastrophic endings were painful transitions to different forms of civilization. This doesn't mean collapse is desirable or that we should welcome it. The suffering of those who lived through ancient resets was real and immense. Famine, war, disease, displacement, loss of loved ones, destruction of everything familiar, the immediate experience was traumatic. The Dark Ages were genuinely dark for those who endured them. We should do everything possible to avoid similar collapses in our own time. But if collapse comes despite our efforts, if the systems we depend on fail, despite our attempts to maintain them, the ancient examples show that endings aren't final. Survivors rebuild. Knowledge can be preserved even when institutions fail. New forms of organization emerge to meet new circumstances. Human creativity and resilience are remarkable, capable of reconstructing civilization even from rubble and ashes. The ancient world didn't end once. It ended multiple times, in different places, in different ways. And each time, something new eventually emerged. The classical civilizations we admire were themselves products of earlier collapses, phoenixes rising from ashes. The medieval civilization that followed Rome's fall eventually produced the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and modernity itself. Endings contain beginnings. What really ended the ancient world was the assumption that any particular form of civilization is permanent, that the systems we build will last forever, that complexity and power confer invulnerability. The Bronze Age palace economies seemed eternal until they collapsed in decades. Rome seemed eternal until it fragmented and disappeared. Every civilization thinks it's different, that it's learned from past mistakes, that it's too advanced or too powerful to fail. History suggests humility is warranted, but history also suggests hope. We're not the first civilization to face existential challenges. We're not the first to experience rapid change, environmental stress, economic disruption, political instability, or military threats. Our ancestors faced these challenges repeatedly and somehow survived, adapted, rebuilt. The ancient resets were catastrophic, but they weren't final. Civilization continued in different forms, carrying forward fragments from what came before and creating something new. The future will be different from the present, perhaps radically so. Whether that difference comes through managed adaptation or catastrophic collapse partly depends on choices we make now. Can we recognize systemic vulnerabilities and build resilience? Can we adapt institutions to changing circumstances? Can we maintain core functions and values through transformation? Can we preserve knowledge and pass it forward even if current systems fail? These aren't abstract historical questions. They're immediate practical challenges facing our interconnected, complex, rapidly changing civilization. The ancient world's resets remind us that collapse is possible, that complexity creates vulnerability, that environmental stress compounds other problems, that institutions can fail, that knowledge can be lost. But they also remind us that survival is possible, that adaptation works, that new forms can emerge, that human resilience is profound. The ancient world ended not once, but many times, and each time a new world began. We're living in one of those worlds now, the inheritors of multiple resets and renewals, standing on foundations built from the rubble of collapsed civilizations. Our world will end too, in some form, at some time. The question is, what will emerge after? What will manage to preserve and pass forward? What new possibilities will open? Understanding history's biggest resets helps us navigate our own moment of transformation, not by providing simple lessons or easy answers, but by showing the complexity of collapse and renewal, the interplay of multiple factors, the importance of resilience and adaptation, the reality of endings and the possibility of beginnings. The ancient world's catastrophes were tragedies for those who lived through them, but turning points for human civilization on longer timescales. We stand at our own potential turning point, facing challenges that could reset our civilization as profoundly as the Bronze Age collapse or Rome's fall reset theirs. Climate change, technological disruption, political fragmentation, economic instability, pandemic threats, the challenges are real and serious, but we're not powerless. We can learn from ancient examples. We can build resilience. We can adapt. We can preserve knowledge. We can maintain values and functions through transformation. The ancient world teaches us that endings are inevitable, but not necessarily final. That collapse is possible, but so is renewal. That complexity creates vulnerability, but also capability. That the future will be different, but not necessarily worse. These lessons matter now more than ever. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, if understanding how ancient civilizations collapsed and renewed might help us navigate our own challenges, then subscribe to Vanishing Myth. Help us preserve these narratives that show both civilization's fragility and human resilience. Because the real danger isn't that our world will change. It's that we'll forget how many times the world has changed before, and how many times people found ways forward even after everything seemed lost. Creating documentaries like this requires hundreds of hours of research, writing, and production. If you'd like to support our work and help us continue preserving these forgotten stories, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Your support allows us to dive deeper into obscure histories, produce longer documentaries, and keep these crucial narratives alive for future generations. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us continue this preservation work. What patterns do you see in our own civilization that remind you of the Bronze Age or late Rome? What vulnerabilities worry you most? What gives you hope that we might navigate our challenges better than our ancestors did? Share your thoughts in the comments. These conversations help us learn from each other's perspectives and build collective understanding of the challenges we face. If this documentary has given you a new way of understanding civilizational collapse and resilience, if it's helped you see patterns connecting ancient resets to modern vulnerabilities, if it's provided context for thinking about our own moment of transformation, then consider liking this video. It helps others discover these crucial historical lessons. And send this to someone wrestling with anxiety about the future, someone trying to understand whether our civilization is vulnerable to collapse, someone who needs historical perspective on contemporary challenges, someone working to build resilience in their community or field. These stories belong to everyone who cares about understanding where we've been and where we might be going. History's biggest resets teach us that no civilization is eternal, but also that endings enable beginnings, that collapse creates space for renewal, that human creativity and resilience can rebuild even after catastrophic loss. The ancient world ended multiple times, and each time something new eventually emerged. Our world will transform too, is transforming now, in ways we can partly shape through our choices and actions. The Bronze Age palace scribes couldn't imagine the classical Greek civilization that would emerge from their dark age. The last Romans couldn't imagine the medieval European civilization that would develop from the empire's fragments. We can't fully imagine what will emerge from our own transformation, but we can work to ensure that the transformation preserves what matters, maintains core functions and values, passes knowledge forward, and creates possibilities for human flourishing in different forms. This is what history's biggest resets ultimately teach us: that change is constant, that endings are beginnings, that complexity requires resilience, that adaptation enables survival, that knowledge must be actively preserved, and that human creativity can rebuild even from rubble. The ancient world didn't end once and for all. It transformed repeatedly, painfully, profoundly. And from each transformation, new possibilities emerged. We're living through our own transformation now. Whether it becomes a catastrophic reset or a managed transition, partly depends on whether we learn from ancient examples, whether we build resilience into our systems, whether we adapt institutions to new realities, whether we preserve knowledge and pass it forward, whether we maintain hope and creativity even in difficult times. The ancient world ended. New worlds began. The cycle continues. We're part of it, inheritors of multiple resets, potential architects of the next renewal. Understanding history's biggest resets doesn't tell us the future, but it helps us navigate it with wisdom, humility, resilience, and hope. And those might be exactly the qualities we need for whatever comes next.